In this video, we're going to be making some clubs with just some firewood, sticks, maybe some dimensional lumber, a dowel, some real basic stuff. And all you're going to need is a drill. I just used a hand drill, not a hand drill, but you know, the power drill. A saw. You can do this with a hand saw, but it's going to take a while. I used a miter saw and a table saw, but you just need a saw. You could probably do this with a chainsaw. Obviously you're going to need some things like sandpaper and drill bits, but really basic tools. And you don't need a lathe. Now, I've been making clubs for 6 years. My first club I made with a machete and a sander. That's it, machete and a sander. Put some oil on it and it works great. Real basic. We've been swinging clubs for, I don't know, a million years. It doesn't need to be perfect. Now, that was 6 years ago. I picked up a lathe 3 years ago and, you know, I kind of got carried away with the work I'm doing. But you don't need to get this involved with the project. This took a month to make. This took an hour. And it works great. Is it as pretty? No. But it has its own quality. If I want to go a little bit more caveman, just a piece of firewood, a stick, and that's about it. So the basic idea is you have the heavy thing, and it's going to need a hole in it, and then you're going to put a stick in the hole, and then you've got a club. What materials you use, a lot of the details, the lengths, the sizes, that's going to be up to you depending on what you want. But again, a stick with a hole, which is essentially what this is, and a stick that goes in the hole. Now, you're probably also going to want to put a pommel on it, and I found the hardware store, they just have pommels. They're real easy. It's just a little ball with a flat spot, a little hole in it. No problem. So, in terms of materials, I built these. These are blocks of dimensional lumber. You're going to need something that's square if you're doing a dimensional lumber, and it has to be dry. If your wood is wet, it will dry eventually, and if you glue everything together with wet wood, you're going to have problems. So if you're using logs, they're going to have to be dry. Here's your basic materials list. We got a few tools. I don't have any epoxy there, but I've got some wood glue, some finish, some sandpaper, wooden parts, got a square, saw, drill, tape measure, drill bits, that type of thing. Now, if you're the type of person who can just watch a bunch of steps and figure out how to do it and go from there, this next 60 seconds is going to be pretty much all you need. This is kind of sped up. This is the process I went through to make the two smaller clubs. You can see I'm cutting the angles to sort of round out the shape a little bit. It's basically an octagon with some angled ends. It's a pretty simple process. It's fairly quick. Now, you're going to want to sand everything down. I'll show that at the end, but essentially I work through the grits, you know, 80, 120, 180, 240, 320, and then get some, I used spray lacquer, but whatever kind of finish you want. You put an oil finish. You don't even have to finish. It'll just protect the club, and it'll last longer. Now, the rest of this video, I'm going to go through every step and talk about the nuances that are important to get this job done. Now, whatever workpiece you're using, you're going to want to mark off the center, because we're going to need to drill exactly in the middle of the workpiece. If it's square, it's going to be a lot easier, but you know, whether you're using a log or whatnot, you're going to need to mark off the center of that log for drilling perfectly square. Now, you're also going to want to make this jig. Now, this is the same, the hole I'm drilling is the same diameter of the handle, and it's just a scrap piece of 2x4. This is going to come in handy several times throughout this project. And you can see I'm testing to make sure that it fits the handle. Alright, so one crucial piece to this is you're going to want to find out what size handle you want to use. If you're going to use a dowel or a stick, you want to make sure that it's a good grip for you.
Inch and an eighth is pretty nice. This is an 1.25 inch dowel. You want to kind of stay away from something that's too big. It's a little unwieldy to swing something that's too large. So an inch might be too small, depending on your hands. If you got larger hands, you'll want a bigger grip in general. Now, you're going to need a drill bit that corresponds to the diameter of your stick. Now, you can use a spade bit, an auger bit, or my preferred Forstner bit. Forstner bit's going to give you a nice flat bottom in the hole, and if you're using a dowel, that's going to work out pretty great. If you get a dowel, you're going to want to make sure that the size that it's supposed to be is actually what it is. When I went to, I wanted to get something commercially available. I could turn a dowel, but just something that's easy to get. And so I grabbed an 1.25 inch dowel and I measured it. I bought some calipers. And it was not an 1.25 inch. It was 1.26 something. This one is actually 1.245. If your dowel is bigger than the hole you're going to make, you're going to run into problems. Now, if you're just working with a stick, you're going to have to custom fit that anyways to make sure that that works in the hole. So if you don't have calipers and you're going to buy a dowel and you know what size you want to do, say you want to do an 1.25 inch, drill a hole through a piece of wood, bring that with you to get the dowel, and make sure that's going to fit in there nice and snug. Now, you're also going to want to figure out what length handle, and if you're making two, you're going to make them obviously the same length. You're going to want a hole that's roughly 2.5 to 3 inches. You can go deeper, that's up to you, depends on how long your drill bit is. This, just based on this, I can only drill about 3 inches max. Looks like 2.75. So if that's my depth that I'm going to drill, I want to take that 2.75, we'll just call it 3 for simple, and figure out how long of a handle I want. Now, one of the Meels that I bought early on that's commercially made, the handle portion was 4.5 inches. That's a good place to start, 4.5 to 6 inches, plus the depth that you're going to cut. So if I'm going to do 3 inches and I make a 6-inch handle, I'm going to need 9 inches of dowel. There's a lot of preference there depending on what you want to do. You want to make it a little bit smaller, you want to make a two-handed handle. That's entirely up to you. The measurements are going to be something you're going to have to figure out on your own, and you're just measuring the depth of the pommel. Pommel is going to come on later. All right, if you're using a handsaw, this will be a little bit different, but if you have access to a miter saw, I want that 8.5 inch handle. So I'm going to measure over, and I'm just going to mark on here 8.5 inches. And I'm going to set up a stop block, just a piece of wood that I can bring the workpiece to make sure I've got consistent length. I'm going to clamp it in place. Take my dowel. Oh, looks like the end of that dowel was not flat. Nice flat end. Take that over the stop block. One. The other. And now I've got 2 even pieces. Now you're going to want to take off if you've got any little splintering in the edge or anything. You want to clean up that edge a little bit. You just take a piece of sandpaper or whatever you happen to have. Just make sure that it's nice and smooth. Now you're going to want to make sure that you drill to a consistent depth on each piece. Old school way to do that, now say you're using this bit, is to measure your depth. Doing this super precise. Mark that depth and then just mark it off with a piece of tape so that as you're going down you can see that tape when it hits the bottom. It's one approach. Now for this, I just know to that point, that's 1.75, I'm just going to drill to there. Now, something about this, you're unlikely to drill perfectly perpendicular to the length of the club. We'll address that in a bit, But for now, you want to be as precise as you can. If you're using a drill press, that's great, but I'm just using a hand drill. This will take a little bit of time, a little bit of work. You want to make sure that you get the depth on each piece even. Now, the chance of drilling a perfectly perpendicular hole is small. Even using a drill press, you know, maybe you're that skilled, but it's almost always going to be off a little bit, but that's okay. We've got a way to fix that. So if I just shove this in there, it might suction in, I might get it stuck. So I'm not going to use the dowel. I use something else that's straight. Push it up against the side of the hole and bring a square up to it. So I can see, turn this a little bit, I can see that it's angled this way a little bit. So sort of put a mark there, check this side. That's actually pretty close right there. What I need to do is actually carve out from the bottom a little bit of that hole so I got a little bit of wiggle room. It's going to create a gap in the bottom, but that's going to be okay. We can fill that with a little epoxy and get it just right. So we don't want to drill out the top of the hole. We want to keep that for center, but we want to correct for an angle. We don't want to take off too much, just a little bit. I'm going to make a little cut here, a couple sides, just to let a little air through. A little bit better of a gap. Should be able to get this in there. Check where we're at. That's actually pretty good. Now, this step may not actually be that necessary. But the epoxy is going to fill these little gaps in here, and since this is pretty smooth, I'm just going to run a few cuts, just little gripping points. The idea is that epoxy will fill in. You can make these a little bit deeper. Epoxy is going to fill in around this, and these are going to act as little catches to hold it in place. Same thing like with you're making a gata, a mace, and you run some nails through there, and then you pour the concrete around it. That helps lock it in place. So just a few marks. All right, so we know we've got the center of our hole perfect because we squared that off and we drilled. So at this point, it's perfectly parallel. As you drill, you may go off at a slight angle, which will make your handle off. Now to fix this, you're going to need to drill, flare out a little bit more, the opposite direction. We're checking that. So our hole shape is more of a fluted shape. Now, we want to make sure that we can get our handle right in the middle here, but we've got this gap here. And that's where the epoxy comes in, because the epoxy is just going to go ahead and fill in all these gaps. And since we have cut little grooves in this stick, it's all going to hold that handle quite well. So we know we're never going to be able to drill exactly perfect down, so we're going to flare it just a little bit so we've got some wiggle room, so we can make sure that it's centered here and centered here, centered in the hole, and then we're just going to wiggle it until we get the epoxy just right. When that sets up, handle's not going anywhere. All right, once you have the holes the way you want them and your dowels seated, you want to double check and make sure that they're the same height. Right, the next step is to get some epoxy in the holes. So we've made sure that we can get these nice and perpendicular to the clubs. Got some room in there. There's a little bit of a gap now because it's fluted at the bottom. We got some channels in here for the epoxy to fill in. Whatever epoxy you want to use is fine. This is a 60-minute work time. This is just a simple little thing. You want to make sure that you have enough for your job. It's better to mix more than you need, and then you know, than to not have enough. Dabbing this stuff inside. Now this one's a bit stickier than the kind I normally use. It's more of a snot consistency, but I think it'll work just fine. That's better. Just up some the excess. Back check our square. Move the handle just where we want it. Straight edge, sighting along. Looks pretty darn good. All right, if you want to put a pommel on the end, that's again super easy. If you don't have a lathe, no problem. They got these little knobs down at the hardware store. Unfortunately, the hardware store down the street from me had a bin for these, but they didn't have any in stock. And I actually went to Joann Fabrics, and they had knobs there. But you can pick them up at Woodpeckers. They're about 75 cents a piece. Or if you just want to go hunt around for them locally, do some searching, you can find them. Now this is a 2-inch knob. This is, I think, a 1 or 1 1/4, whatever this, 1.5 knob. I like an 1.75 inch in between these two. They didn't have these at the store I went to, but this will be fine. So I'm gonna put a 2-inch knob, and these have little flat spots, and they already have a hole drilled. Now, what I've discovered is that hole isn't in the middle, and that's actually fine. Doesn't really matter. I'll show that later. But the problem is the flat spot and the dowel are different sizes. I actually want to make this flat spot bigger. Now you can do that. You have to clamp it down or something. Maybe set it in a hole. We've got our little drill block. Set the round hole in there. That's going to make it more stable. You can cut it by hand. I don't recommend sanding it down because you're never going to get a flat surface, so we need to have a flat surface. I'm going to end up using the chop saw, and for this I'm just going to put this again. Put a little super glue on this. Put a little accelerator spray over here. Easy peasy. Let that set up a little bit. So this is probably not an OSHA approved strategy, but I've got that ball on there. This isn't a super solid joint, but it will give me something where I can use my miter saw. Again, this is what I did. You may find a different approach that works better for you. Make good safety choices, but I'm going to go ahead and lop that off right about there. Unlikely that'll leave a little bit of an edge. You can clean that up with a knife. Cool. Now, that pommel will sit much more nicely. All right, these knobs already have a pre-drilled hole that goes part way through. Now, my experience with these thus far is that hole is never going to be exactly center. That actually doesn't matter that much, but we're going to take our handy dandy jig that we made before. We use that to support the workpiece. If you just try and do that, it's not going to work out very well. So that gives us a nice jig. We're going to get that nice and flat. And we're just going to punch a hole all the way through. Then, got a hole come out the other side. We're going to actually be sending a screw through this later. And actually, that's pretty close to the exact center, but we're going to countersink it. This is a broken bit, but it works okay. I'm going to create a little space for the top head of the screw to sit flush with the outer side of the ball. So now, it's going to be important that the end of your dowel and the flat spot on the ball are perfectly flat. If you didn't get a clean cut, you can take a sheet of paper, put it on a perfectly flat surface, and just drag it across until you have a nice smooth surface. All right, we're going to want to glue the pommel to the handle. We're going to let that cure, but then we're going to run a screw through it afterwards. Now, reason being, we need to reinforce the joint. So people often do a demo with straws for in place of wood fibers, but I don't have any straws, I got wood. So imagine that these are wood fibers. There's a substance that holds these fibers together called lignin. It's a pretty strong bond, you can't just rip wood apart, but lignin is what keeps it all together. Now, wood glue has a stronger bond than the wood, but only stitching the fibers together. The fibers are stronger than what keeps them together this direction. So the grain on our dowel is running in the direction of the wood fibers. So that's super strong. And granted, this bond is stronger than what keeps the wood together between the fibers. It'll be somewhat weak. If you drop this, this could pop off. Now, once you glue it, let it cure, drill a little pilot hole, run a screw into it that'll reinforce the wood glue, and you're good to go. And you need to make sure these surfaces are dead flat. Wood glue has really great adhesion, gluing two wooden surfaces together. So you want to fill all the pores with glue, stick them together tightly. When that cures, it'll be nice and solid. Now, if you have a gap, say this isn't nice and flat, that surface in between is not going to bond very well. Wood glue has very poor cohesion. Like it in itself isn't strong, but it's stronger in knitting things together. If you do have a gap and you can't get rid of it, use epoxy. Epoxy has great cohesion. It'll fill that gap and it'll work just as well. It just might be messy or take a little time. I like wood glue. Also, with the wood glue, I can get this set and I can kind of spot around and make sure that it's perfectly centered, let it cure, then put the screw in. If you put the screw in while the glue is not cured, the screw might actually move it out of center. So it'll be a little two-step process, take a little bit more time, but it'll work better in the long run. Now, if you're using a round log, this step isn't necessary, but if you're using square dimensional lumber, you're going to want to lop off those corners. Just using the table saw, but you use whatever you have available. Then you're going to want to round the top and the bottom. I'm going to use a router, but you can use a saw or a sander, whatever you have. Next, we're going to want to glue the pommels on. Kind of push that glue into the pores, squeeze it on there, and then wipe off the excess. Once the glue is set up for about 5 minutes, it's stable enough to clamp on there. I'm just using a sheet of plywood, and I'm going to put some weight on there. I'm actually going to use a couple of club blanks. If you have clamps, that's great. You just want to make sure that they don't slide around, so I let it sit for about 5 minutes, put some weight on it, clamped it down, and then you're going to want to let it cure for at least an hour before you drill. Alright, now that the glue is cured up a bit, we're going to want to continue this pilot hole. And we're going to put a screw down that goes into the handle. We're going to need a little bit of a pilot hole because we don't want to split anything. You know, these bits have little self-tapping screw bits in there, which will help keep it from expanding further down. But just drill our pilot hole. Back on. And one last step here. The only
thing left here is to sand and put a finish on it. Now, you want to work through the grits, take your time. You can round some of those corners off, make it a little bit smoother. And then I used a spray lacquer. Deft makes a good, decent spray lacquer. There's the can there. And just follow the manufacturer instructions. You can use whatever finish you want. I hope you enjoyed this video. I had a lot of fun making these. If you end up making some of your own, I'd love to hear about it. They're pretty inexpensive and pretty easy to make, so I hope you enjoyed this.